First of all, thanks for coming out tonight. This is the first panel of 6 that we have planned over the next month and a half to 2 months or so. So this one, as David mentioned, on transportation. So we'll have 6 panels in total. I'll just provide just a little bit of background on kind of the panel ideas and the discussion. So we'll have 2 on transportation, 1 in the evening, and then another one in the morning. We'll have 2 on economic development, same thing, 1 in the evening. And then we're going to have 2 more on housing. So those are the 3 topics. There'll be 2 panels for each of the topics that I mentioned over the next 2 months or so. I think the announcement just went out today or yesterday for the housing panel, number 1, on March 13th. We got in the morning at 8 or 8:30, so keep your eyes out for that. I think there's some flyers in the back. So each of the panels will be about an hour or so. We're going to do about 40 minutes-ish of some questions that RKG and the town staff have put together for the panelists. And then for about 15 or 20 minutes toward the end, we're going to open it up for audience questions. So just on that, if you can hold your questions until that period, that would be great, so we can kind of have a dialogue and you can hear from the panelists as we go through those questions. The other thing that we want to try to do is, since this is sort of the intro portion to the comp plan, which will be starting, I think, in earnest in a couple of months, we're going to try to keep the discussion kind of 25,000 foot level, regional, statewide, national trends, examples, that kind of stuff. None of us, I'll admit, are Lexington experts, so I don't think any of us feel comfortable speaking about Lexington in particular, so if we can keep all those questions kind of trends, challenges, opportunities around transportation, that would be great. If you do have any kind of Lexington-specific questions, I believe everybody has a blue index card. If you don't have one, then David can provide you with one. You can jot your sort of Lexington-specific questions down. They're going to record all those, and then those will sort of feed into the comp plan down the line. So as David said, just a quick intro. My name is Eric Halverson. I'll be moderating the 2 panels on transportation. We have 2 principals from RKG who will be moderating the housing panels as well as the economic development panels. So you'll see me, most of them, and some of our other staff there as well. Just a little really quick about RKG. We're a planning and real estate firm founded in 1981 in New Hampshire, and we've recently relocated to downtown Boston. We have a couple other offices up and down the East Coast, but we've been focused for about 40 years on sort of planning, development, economic issues all across New England. So I'm really excited to be here in Lexington tonight. So I know that I just talked about not focusing on Lexington necessarily, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least make mention of kind of unique position that, at least as an outsider looking in toward Lexington, I see your town as having. So you're really at the crossroads of sort of Route 2 and 128. You have easy access to Route 4, Route 2A, Route 3 is just to the north. So from a vehicular transportation standpoint, Lexington really has a lot of great roadway assets, I would say, and sort of easy access if you're not driving during peak commuting times, which I know many of you are. But also presents a challenge, right? Presents a challenge for getting around, having all those sort of more regional roadways, but it keeps Lexington, I think, at least for this panel's discussion, connected to the region, so the larger region. Lexington doesn't just exist in this sort of bubble, it's really connected to everybody else. And I think Lexington's also kind of a leader in 2 other areas of transportation, at least as I see it. One is you have a huge asset in the Minuteman Bikeway. It's got to be probably the most heavily used multi-use path in the state, if not much more region than that. And Lexington also has made investments in itself in terms of sort of public transportation. You do have MBTA service, bus service, as spotty as it may be, but you also have the LexPress, which is the local service that the town pays into, which is very unique. Not a lot of towns around the region have that, so you've sort of taken that additional step to invest in yourselves and provide that for your residents. And you've also taken the step to invest in sort of the business community on the private side with the 128 Business Council, their ability to help serve and connect businesses and the folks who work for those businesses, not only here in Lexington, but in the surrounding area. So I think from a transportation standpoint, we're thinking about suburbs on the fringe of Boston. I mean, Lexington's actually doing a lot of really good things, and I think the panelists might sort of touch on some of the things that I may have missed. So to that end, I'd just like to introduce this great panel we brought together, who have national, state, and regional experience and have worked at all levels of government, including down at the local level. So first of all, immediately to my left is Eric Barassa. Eric's the Director of Transportation at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MEPC. Many of you have probably heard the regional planning agency for the greater Boston area. So Eric's been the director there since 2009 and manages all aspects of the agency's transportation planning, transportation technical assistance to municipalities, and regional and statewide transportation policy initiatives. Mr. Barassa oversees an interdisciplinary team of planners that conduct regional transportation studies, provide technical assistance to municipalities, and research critical policy issues facing Greater Boston. In addition to being an MEPC, Eric also is the vice chair of the Boston Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO. We can touch on that too. Working alongside folks from MassDOT, the MBTA, and the Central Transportation Planning Staff, City of Boston, other agencies and municipalities that sit with him on that board making transportation funding decisions for the region. Next to Eric is Stacy Thompson from Livable Streets Alliance. Stacy is the Executive Director of Livable Streets, overseeing all programs including Vision Zero, Better Buses, the Emerald Network, and ensuring overall programmatic and operational excellence for their organization. Stacy's a relentless optimist, undaunted by the many challenges facing Metro Boston today, including increasing access to jobs and affordable housing, improving safety and public health outcomes, and building climate resiliency. And Stacy believes that improving our streets isn't simply a transportation issue, but one of justice, equity, and opportunity. And then finally, next to Stacy is Jason Degray. Jason works at Tool Design Group, an engineering firm. But Jason also is a member of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and sits on their board as a representative, I think, on the advocacy front of ITV. So as I mentioned, Jason's the New England Engineering Director for Tool Design Group. He currently oversees engineering and design efforts, which include the recent rapid implementation of separated bike facilities along Cambridge Street and within Harvard Square in Cambridge, Boston's Vision Zero and active transportation programs, and the City of Providence's Unifying City Walk Initiative. I also want to say this was 100% volunteer for the panelists, so I'm really happy that they're all here. Thank you for your time. So I know I just provided an introduction, but getting a little bit maybe more personal, can you give the audience just 1 to 2 minutes, day to day, what do you actually do? What I just said, what does that really actually mean? How does that translate into transportation in your day-to-day? Eric, you want to start?
Sure. So for folks who might not be familiar with Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MEPC, we're an independent state agency, and we work with 101 cities and towns that make up Greater Boston. And we're really interested in, from a transportation perspective, how does transportation facilitate good growth and good land use, and how does that how do we grow in a sustainable way? And how does transportation actually facilitate the ability to, for our region to grow and have economic growth, but also so that we can do it in such a way that we're not, killing ourselves with traffic congestion, that we're promoting, transit and walking and biking and being able to grow in a transit-oriented way. That's really the kind of the main perspective that we look at transportation, that through that kind of lens, that nexus between land use and transportation.
Yeah, and so Livable Streets Alliance is partnered by BC. We also work very closely with Tool, but we are, at our core, I actually say we're not a transportation organization, we're an access and equity organization. And so the underpinning of our advocacy philosophy is that you use your streets to have access to something, and those streets need to serve people. So, we often end up talking about bike lanes, about buses, about parking, but that's because, older folks who maybe have mobility issues are trying to get to the hospital for an appointment. Kids are trying to get to school. Folks are trying to get to work on time. And so we try to frame every conversation we have around those key livability issues, and then ensure that our streets, which are often our largest shared public spaces, so when you think about just how much space Lexington has, that's streets, that's all yours to share. And when you start thinking about your streets that way, like it's yours and it's mine, and we're all using it in creative and different ways, that's how we think about transportation and planning, and then we move forward. Livable Streets primarily works in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Brookline, but increasingly we are seeing a lot of leadership from communities like Lexington, like Chelsea, like Everett, like Newton, that are really leapfrogging some of the bigger cities. So I'm excited you guys are engaging in this conversation.
So as the engineering director for Tool Design Group, I find myself spending most of my days convincing communities why striping a bike lane is not going to bring economic calamity and social destruction to these communities. Tool Design Group, the company I work for, is fairly unique in the transportation arena, and now we are probably the premier company nationwide that specializes on active transportation. We lead every project we enter into, how this project will benefit those walking, biking, accessing the transit. And that puts us in a fairly unique sphere in the transportation consulting arena, where we're often the change agents that try to be brought into a community to discuss about the value proposition of how we're reframing our streets and what are the underlying values of the community, how are those shifting over time, how are communities going to set themselves up for the future in a sustainable manner, and how does that relate to transportation. And ultimately, as I like to say, I don't think the transportation system is just a foundation for the land use, so you can't have a transportation policy without really talking about your land use policy. So these are the conversations that we have every day with communities. We are an engineering company. We ultimately are trying to take projects out of the planning sphere and put them in the ground and getting them built. And that really depends on the audience to which we're speaking to and how that resonates with the community. But every day is a fun, challenging day, and every community is different. And certainly value the opportunity to have these conversations throughout the region as we talk about the equitable system of our transportation network and how it's going to benefit the region as a whole going forward.
I've done a couple of comp plans and master plans in my time, and I always feel like when we start them, everybody wants to talk about the issues that are here today, and what's going on in our community. I want to talk about this intersection and this missing sidewalk connection. So thinking about the today, but at the broader scale, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that our greater Boston region, or maybe even the state of Massachusetts, faces today? Not even thinking about the future, but just looking at today.
Jim first.
Anybody, sure.
I mean, I certainly think big picture with transportation, the funding issue always looms large. I think the MBTA, the transit system, is clearly underfunded. I think that we're as a state, we're trying to get our arms around what really are the asset management needs for the MBTA. That's a big focus of the Baker administration, is to understand what are the state of good repair needs to just basically maintain the MBTA that we have today. And then I think looking into the future, then we need to figure out, okay, then what's the system we need to accommodate the future growth moving forward. But funding is huge, I think, on the transit side. But I also think that on the roadway side, we also have huge funding needs, and I think that that's a big issue. And I think that issue of how we fund transportation is gonna there's this potential for this millionaires tax conversation over the course of the next year. I think that issue of how we fund transportation is going to be something that's on the forefront statewide, and I think that's an important issue. And I think there was a MassInc poll just released today that identified transportation being one of the sort of top issues among voters.
I'm gonna echo funding, but add two other trends to the pool. I think we have to real talk about congestion. Every community is projecting population increases. And we're not gonna bring more people into the region if we don't get real about zoning, if we don't get real about not just fixing our transit system as it is today, but really enhancing and increasing transit access. Otherwise, we're just gonna put more cars on the roads. And if you guys think it's bad today and we just sort of don't start to get comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations around funding, around service improvements, we're all just gonna be sitting in cars really frustrated. So, we're trying to push that competition a little more to the forefront and say, is that really the future we want, or do we wanna, get real and make some changes now? Alternatively, I think there's a misperception that millennials really like biking and walking. When you actually look at the data, biking and walking is increasing in popularity across all age demographics, and I think we're gonna see a really exciting increase in older adults valuing and prioritizing walking and biking in their communities, and making sure that they have access to the things that they want in a much sort of closer, denser, easier way to access without an automobile. So things to keep in mind.
So I'm gonna beat a dead horse and say funding is probably the most significant issue, but I don't know if it encapsulating that, issue, that topic is really, grandiose enough. I think where we are right now in the build out of our infrastructure in this country is really at the end of, probably the second or third generation of life cycle cost of investment into what is honestly just an explosion of roadway networks that have been built out since the war. It's really unprecedented in its scale of an engineering undertaking anywhere in the history of the world. Mobility was defined by people on foot for thousands of years. It wasn't until the 18th century where, steam locomotion really started to become a powerful force. The automobile has been around for really, 100 years in scale. We have a crisis looming that I don't think the bulk of the population is really cognizant of, that, we never had a maintenance plan for building all this infrastructure. And the check has come due, and, that is going to progressively fall more and more on local shoulders. If you look at what's coming out of Washington in terms of this funding plan, given the regime that's coming from, I think you take it with a grain of salt, but, they're talking about flipping the equation of what is now a 20% local match to 80% federal funding, and flipping that on its head, so it's a 20% federal match to 80% local funding. There are many communities out there today that can't, get their infrastructure built out or maintained based on the existing paradigm, never mind how they're gonna do it in the future. So, to me, how we're gonna fund a sustainable transportation system is really the only question. Other issues start to break off from that in terms of safety. As our infrastructure deteriorates, the safety need in our communities is going through the roof. Pedestrian fatalities are, on a are increasing at an alarming rate over these past few years. And those trends look to stay in that pattern. How this country gets its arms around this issue is really, I think, at the core of a lot of what, the political divide that kind of separates us. I see that kind of all coming back to how we built out our infrastructure over the past 60, 70 years, and how we're going to grapple with it, and what are those value-laden decisions that are before all of us.
So Jason, just thinking about the funding piece, give me one idea generating new revenue sources, other than raising taxes. What do you think? Are there other places out there that are doing it? How are they doing it? LA tax, right? LA's got Measure R, address, whatever it was. They tax themselves. Washington's doing it.
Yeah. I don't know, I'm not the expert in really the policy decision around funding to answer that question, but, you do see a lot of creative, ideas around, in Boston, we tax Uber and Lyft to fund, a fairly antiquated taxi service. Other, parts of the country are applying that tax to, funnel that back into the transit service. We do have to look at other revenue streams, but, I think we need to look seriously about where the bulk of our funds currently go. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars on, big infrastructure roadway projects, but we can't find, $50,000 to do wheelchair ramps and improve accessibility at the local level. The entire system is geared towards big highway infrastructure, and that's really where the change has to be in the future. And I would say for a community that seeks to invest in itself, at some point, you really do have to put your money where your mouth is. If there's a project that really goes to the economic value of your base, then, I would say you have to be willing to fund that locally. That's where they're gonna be pushing you anyways, and, understanding that the local priorities, get funded, getting them funded locally really sets your priorities in line. You start in your most fundamental, highest value infrastructure, which is typically in your downtowns, your main street, and you look at it not necessarily from what, is necessary to move as many cars as possible through this corridor, but how do we make this a livable place that really gives, that foundation for a, prosperous economic land use for the next generation.
How about you, Eric? Any ideas?
Well,
Well,
MAPC, we've actually pushed some legislation around regional ballot initiatives, so giving cities and towns the ability, either as individual municipalities or to team up with their neighbors, the ability to put a question to the voters to tax themselves to fund infrastructure and transportation, and we're hopeful that could get some action. We're also supporters of concepts around value capture, so trying to leverage new growth that's associated with transportation investments that open up land for accessibility or transit connections, to try to leverage that growth to help fund some of those transportation improvements. We're also supporters of the concept of like congestion pricing or EMT fees or things like that, that would try to potentially even replace the gas tax as the vehicles become more fuel efficient, and that starts to erode the value, but get at those types of charging people for the usage of the roadway or the miles that are traveled, and then use some of those resources to go back into the public transit system to try to make that system better so that you can actually encourage more people to get off the road. So we've been supportive of a number of different kind of ideas like that.
Yeah, I just want to echo or jump in and say that one thing that we observe a lot is a lot of finger pointing. And I would just say in each of these examples, I think it's really important to be hyper-specific about, is that something that individuals of the town are going to be going to the legislator to advocate for, because that's where the holdup is, that we need to increase the gas tax and we need to start talking to our elected officials and X, Y, and Z, or really need to get serious about congestion pricing, in which case that's going to require some political will, right? Or is it a need to look at our local investments and say, yes, we need to quadruple the amount of money we are spending on our sidewalks, on our crosswalks, and be hyper granular about that. We sit in rooms every single day. I'm gonna use Boston. I'm gonna throw Boston under the bus to talk about buses. I sat down with every single city councilor in the city of Boston, and not one of them knew that the city of Boston controlled their streets and could do a lot of work. They kept saying, oh, the T has to fix the buses. Here are all the things the T has to do. And I was like, well, you guys can put some paint on the ground and give us a bus lane. And they're like, oh, that's not the T, that's us. And so, I just want to say, I would love to see less finger pointing. I would love to see less like, we're going to take responsibility for X, Y, and Z and fund this thing because we care, and then we're going to show up at a control board meeting because we're going to advocate for the T to do this thing because we don't control that anymore. And how do you guys start thinking about that strategically?
Great. I like that answer a lot. So I feel like when you read news articles and you look online, Massachusetts seems to be at the forefront of a lot of different things, right? A leader in things, but referencing the recent Massing poll, I think USA Today came out with some rankings, where they ranked sort of the best states to live in, and Massachusetts again ranked, I think 45th or something in infrastructure. In the Massing poll, I think rated infrastructure, transportation is #1, people's priority list. So in terms of infrastructure, we don't necessarily seem to be at the forefront or kind of leading when compared to other states or maybe other regions that we're trying to compete against. So I'm wondering, are there other places either around the country or other cities and towns that maybe we should be looking to or thinking about sort of best practices, examples of transportation infrastructure that's working, mobility solutions for people? Interested in your opinions. Do you have any case studies that you refer to more often than not when you're talking to cities and towns? How about start with Stacy?
Do you want to just
Sure.
I mean, examples, all right, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, I think if we're talking about cities and towns, I'm gonna throw out the Everett example. Again, my focus, I feel like I have two experts with me tonight who are much better at getting into the granular pieces. If you really wanna know about zoning, talk to this guy. If you wanna know about everything that's happening everywhere in the country around transportation, talk to this guy. If you wanna know about how stuff gets done, I would say talk to me and let's look at Everett. They put down a bus lane, right, and it's gotten a lot of attention. What I like about this story is that they saw it as really common sense. They had a little tiny piece of backup. It was like, it's not a huge issue. It's like, I'm not gonna get into it. The point is, they said, we're gonna try to put this bus lane down just during rush hour and see what happens, throw some cones out. When we talked to the project manager, we said, well, what sort of public process you go through? And he said, the pilot was the process. We just did it and let people experience it. And then they liked it so much that we kept it. That's super common sense. That's not spending a lot of time on resources. And if it didn't work, they could tweak it and fix it. But they made it permanent because it did work. And so I would say, I would really point you to your peers. Watertown is doing some similar work right now around some greenways and just getting creative and smart and doing things quickly. So I will leave it there.
Hold on, I'll jump in real quick.
Yeah.
So I like this idea of piloting. So I was in a town about an hour, I'm not gonna name it, but in an hour south of Boston the other day, and I was talking to somebody about land use and zoning in their downtown, and they said that this area around the green, it's got all these state roadways that come in. The area is just crazy when you look at it. I said, yeah, but it's gonna cost millions of dollars to do the engineering and fix this. And I said, do you ever think about just putting up some cones and testing something? And because they said, oh, no one's gonna like it. I said, why don't you just test it? It seems like that's the new thing, the sort of tactical urbanism, pilot projects, very small money to just try things out before you invest in hiring a tool and spend $1 million to design something that's gonna build it. Not that I'm trying to put that in a job. You know, I know you've been around the country. I mean, you're involved in these conversations. Are people doing more and more of this sort of pilot and testing thing? And is that something we should be pushing in the region?
It's definitely a tool in the toolbox. I mean, it's to some degree, it's kind of the hot thing that's out there for, you know, quickly deploying alternatives and testing and, you know, demonstrating that, you know, things are not going to be calamitous and, you know, with the comfort of knowing we can, you know, wipe it all away if it's not going to work. I've also seen it though used as basically that's the end of the road. Like we're going to throw some paint flex floats out there and, you know, wash our hands and we've done our test. You know, for those that are committed, it is most definitely a very useful tool. The whole tactical urbanism approach is about community engagement and getting ownership in, you know, our public spaces, and, you know, it should be used accordingly. I will say, you know, it is about leadership a lot of times. If the community is willing to do something like that, really speaks a lot to, you know, the ability to you know, implement change. Having been involved in a few of those projects, I can tell you that you don't ask too many questions. You know, you get a couple of people in the community that, you know, seem to be willing to do it, and you just, let's go. Because once you start asking questions, you know, someone's gonna start thinking about liability and start asking some other questions. And it really, I mean, it does, you know, put those willing to, you know, put themselves on the line in a position that maybe not totally fair, because, you know, the intention is all well and good, but if, you know, something were to happen, God forbid, during one of those, you know, installations, it's been my fear. I just hope we make it through today without something that comes back and basically bankrupts the company because, you know, we didn't have the right insurance policy or something like that. But I never had that experience. Every tactical project I've been involved with has been a fantastic event that has, you know, brought the community out and really engaged and built up a groundswell of support. But the real challenge happens, what do you do after that point? How do you capitalize on that and ensure that that success goes forward and doesn't just dissipate over time?
Eric, can I put you on the spot real quick? Only because I was down in Maynard a couple months ago on a project, and I brought up the downtown project that MAPC did, and we sort of deployed that over the course of a week or a weekend. Maybe you could talk briefly about that, and sort of, that's just down the road.
Yeah, in Maynard Center, they were very interested in testing bicycle lanes and taking on-street parking and using that as like a parklet. Actually, something that Lexington does every summer. It was one of the first actually towns to do something like that in front of the bicycle cafe. And so what we did was, over the course of basically a couple days, we just put down some reflecting tape to act as bike lane. We were able to get cones and be able to create some different sort of turning lanes and things like that to just test different treatments. We were able to take some parking spaces and put AstroTurf and like lawn chairs down on them. This was in the summer, and just kind of and put up a lot of signage explaining what we were doing, and we staffed it over the course of a couple of days so that people who were driving or walking through could ask questions about it, and we could kind of answer, and that was very helpful. And they have had some plans to actually make some of these permanent changes. It does take time to actually go through the design and then change the physical geometry of a downtown like that. But again, yeah, that's an exciting thing that you can do and test on short money.
Yeah. I'm going to jump around real quick because I feel like I want to get to this. I hope the audience wants me to get to this too, but I feel like everywhere I go working on these projects, I just keep hearing about this silver bullet that's out there, or at least what everybody thinks is going to be the silver bullet for transportation. Driverless cars, autonomous vehicles. I have heard arguments on both sides of the table, so I am very interested to hear your 45-second sort of pitch on what you think about driverless cars. Silver bullet, myth, mixable. Start with Jason, come down.
I'd say 80% myth and 20% fixable. I mean, I think it's clear that technological advances are going to have profound impacts on mobility, already has in just the last couple of years. But the notion of fully autonomous vehicles is something that it's been out there for decades, if not longer. It feels like it's getting somewhat closer in reality. As someone who goes into signal cabinets quite often, I can tell you, before we have a fully networked, autonomous system, we should really, look at the system that we currently have and ask ourselves why we can't maintain that. There's not a traffic signal cabinet that I could go into right now and find 4 or 5 things that are not as they were supposed to be, and try to concentrate on that. But that being said, I think that the system is going to quickly evolve, and that's going to come at us in a myriad of ways that we're not going to be able to quite anticipate. We have to be ready to capitalize on those improvements. But as the point that was made earlier too, even if we did achieve a fully autonomous system, there are 1,000 equity issues that are still going unaddressed. And quite frankly, that's where I think a lot of the conversation should reside, and one that we pass over quite quickly when we start talking about autonomous systems.
How many people here have cruise control in their car? You're already driving an autonomous vehicle. What I don't think people realize is that autonomy is here. There are 5 levels of autonomy, and if you purchase a brand new car today, you're like somewhere in the neighborhood of level 3. And so this is technology that has been happening in your car and in your life for a long time, and it hasn't seemed like it's changed your existence very much, has it? So I would just say, a lot of people talk about it in terms of your personal vehicle. I would say, I would agree with everything that Jason has said and add to that, that I think it's actually more important for us to think about autonomous technology in terms of public transportation and how it could make it safer and more flexible and more efficient. And are we prepared to upgrade our services and invest in those services so that we can have a really great, really autonomous public transportation system in the future? If we're not willing to repair tracks and update cars now, what does that mean for our autonomous future in public transportation? And I would say, in terms of like shipping, trucking, that's where autonomy is a lot easier to use. The closer you get to a dense urban core, it's a lot harder to use and think about this technology. So it's not going to be you guys all in your car like reading your paper going to work in 5 years. It's going to come at us in different ways, and it's already here. So lastly, I'm going to steal a line from Wendy Landman. We all still want to walk. your favorite places are still gonna be your city centers, your urban cores. Everyone's favorite towns around the country are places where you can go and walk around and have fun. That's not gonna change.
Yeah, it's a big question mark, and I think that there's a couple different ways to think about. One is I think it's really unclear when when fully autonomous vehicles are coming, and I mean, some people are optimistic and think we're going to see them within the next 5 years. There's 2 companies testing in the Seaport right now. We've had a lot of conversations with them. There's a lot of complicated things that have to happen for a vehicle to be able to make, things like left-hand turns, a lot of different things that have to, that the vehicle has to think about. And will we eventually see autonomous vehicles in 10 or 15 years? I think it's highly likely. I think the way that we interact with them will be different than the way we currently interact with automobiles, where we own them as individuals. I think what we'll start to see is more of a network of essentially autonomous like taxi fleets provided by the Uber and Lyfts of the world. This concept of transportation as a service, similar to like your cable service or another service that you can dial up on demand. That's how a lot of people are thinking about how we will interact with these types of things. I think how we think about it in terms of how it could affect, as Eric was saying, there could be great things where we see a decrease in auto ownership. It helps to really encourage the kind of growth in urban areas, and people can live more of a lifestyle where they don't own cars and they walk and they bike and they take transit, and they also can dial up an autonomous taxi wherever they want. But there's also this perspective that it could really encourage suburban sprawl, where people are like, oh great, like I don't care if my commute is 2 hours. If I'm not driving, I can read, I can sleep, I can do work in the car, and traffic doesn't seem that bad. I know if these cars are all talking to each other, they'll be more efficient in using the roadway. So there's kind of a heaven and hell of what the future could be with autonomous vehicles. I do think that as a town, as you're contemplating doing a master plan, things that I think autonomous vehicles will impact are things like parking. And if you were suddenly thinking, oh, we should build a parking garage in our downtown, like I would say that's a bad investment, because a parking garage is it's like a 40, 50-year asset. And I would think that the next 20 years, that the way that these cars, are going to, like the amount of parking supply we need will go down dramatically. And so that's a redevelopment opportunity. Is actually your downtown parking is a redevelopment opportunity. The space that we use right now to park our vehicles is also an opportunity to think about the on-street space as actually reverting it to potentially its original use. A lot of people don't even realize that where the term parking came from. It was actually a movement in the late 1800s to create green space in between the roadway, which was used by horses, kind of a stinky space, and where people were walking, and it was a movement to create little parks. But then as automobiles became more prevalent, that was the space where we stored automobiles, and to this day, the term parking is so ubiquitously connected to automobiles that we don't even remember what the original sense of the term was. So, so again, I think that is a big potential change, but it has a lot of consequences, and it needs to be done right.
Yeah, I think the key is to not stop investing in the other modes of transportation.
Absolutely not, no.
Great. Well, that puts us right at 7:45. So I did say this, we're going to go until about 8, at least about 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So I didn't know, David, should people come up or are you going to?
Yeah, I can float. I'll walk around.
Okay.
Hands up, any questions? First.
I have 3 questions. There's probably other people that want to speak, so maybe I should ask one and then go back. So my first question, what options does Lexington have to improve commute times to Cambridge and Boston?
Can you repeat that?
What options do we have in Lexington to improve our commute times working in Cambridge and Boston?
Yeah, I actually think Stacy was talking about dedicated bus lanes. So Arlington is actually going to be looking at trying to improve the sort of the 77 corridor, and looking at are there ways of creating like dedicated bus lane, portions of dedicated bus lane. So for folks who might be connecting to some of those bus routes that are going through Arlington, that could be a solution there. It's just one idea.
Yeah, I would just echo, the T is collecting a tremendous amount of data on their bus routes right now, and you can see very clearly where choke points are in the system, and they're about to be going through a service planning process, eventually a bus restructuring process, and so I think this is a really important opportunity for you all to figure out how you want to plug into those processes as a municipality and really look 2 or 3 layers beyond your community to see maybe something's happening in Arlington or Cambridge that's making you lose 15 minutes every night with your family, and how can you plug into that bigger process. The second piece is cross-municipal collaboration. You guys are doing a good job of this, but the more you can talk to your neighbors about these problems and figure out where you're maybe fudging things up for each other on the borders, it can be tremendously helpful. Little tiny fixes can go a long way.
It strikes me that one of the big problems with transportation like buses is that a certain number of people have to live close enough to the bus stop to make it viable. And it seems that many of the neighborhoods in Lexington are already much too sparsely populated for that to be a workable solution. So I'm wondering if you've dealt with that question as people are planning how to occupy a town, not so much Lexington because we're pretty mature, but Franklin or some of the 495 Beltway towns, they may have been forced to make land use planning decisions to deal with some of those eventualities. I'm wondering if you can comment on those things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. I mean, we work with so many communities where there's a real desire for wanting to see more public transit options, but their land use is just not, does not have the density to support public transit. And so we're trying to look at what are different models, flexible bus routes that, trying to tap into the sort of the Uber Lyft type technology where you could have buses that could be on, that have a fixed route, but then could be on demand in certain places. Really looking at some of these, ways of coming up with some type of hybrid service, or oftentimes it's about providing maybe that connection, that sort of like first mile connection to the commuter rail station, so that they can use public transit, but it's hard to get from somebody's house to the commuter rail and then take that into Boston. But yeah, those are big challenges, particularly for the municipalities that don't have the real density to support public transit.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things to this. One, tool we are privileged to work with Mass DOT to author the first, statewide bicycle plan and pedestrian plan, which has components of identifying gaps in those networks as they relate to, opportunities, and, looking to prioritize our investments in a manner that actually seeks to close those gaps in the most efficient way possible. I think that's going to bring some improvement. There's no doubt that the sparsity of the density in the outlying suburbs and the exurbs is going to be an issue for quite some time on this topic, but there are things we can do to just improve on our existing land use. And I can't necessarily do that question without going back to the experience I had with Eric in Braintree, where I look at that Braintree station and it's completely isolated from an abutting neighborhood, because when that station was built, it was seen as it was going to bring in an undesirable element from the city, and they wanted to completely shut off from the red line. And now it's as if that this asset, and they want to open up, and then they're completely wondering why that was the process in the first place. So it is about that value-laden decision process that we make our communities and the decisions we make from a previous generation rolling forward, and how we deal with them now.
I know I'm the moderator, but I'll add one quick point to it. I've seen some communities out this way, maybe a little further down the two, that have sort of created a regional in-town sharing system of transit. They've been using smaller vans, council on aging vans, in order to get people to commuter rail stations or to other places where they want to go. And one thing they've been trying to do is almost implement like a mini park and ride system where they can funnel people from out of the neighborhoods. Now, a lot of them end up having to get in a car for one of the legs of their trip, but then they're going to a collection point, parking, then getting on the van and going to another place. So as a way to kind of get people aggregated, get them out of the neighborhoods, aggregate them at a collection point that's common, and then try to get them onto public transportation is another option that I've seen some other communities do. And down in Connecticut along the CT Fast Tracks line that they built between Hartford and New Britain, I think they have 9 new bus rapid transit stations down there. They've, for better or worse, have built substantially large parking lots around those stations as a way to try to get people to funnel out of surrounding residential areas into a common collection point, get on the BRT route and get to where they're going.
So going forward, if you just say your name to the mic.
My name is Mark Sandine. You mentioned at the beginning that Lexington's at a confluence of a bunch of roadways. And when I wake up in the morning, all I need to do is look out my window to see what the state of the roadways are, because there's a lot of people cutting through when the roads are stopped. And I was wondering if you had any ideas what communities can do to address this issue of people jumping off of 128 and driving through the community.
It's a tough issue because one person's cut through is another person's, commute. I think that from a regional perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing because that sort of spreads things out. But from a local perspective, that's not good. Obviously, if people are cutting through more residential streets, you really don't want that traffic there. That's where you can think about implementing, different traffic calming measures, trying to, called bulb outs or push outs or that kind of thing. You narrow the roadway and you try to create a way of slowing down traffic so people don't want to be there. It's hard to do it if people are trying to cut through, Mass Ave and come through, the downtown or that kind of thing, and you have only a limited amount of, space that you can allocate to things. Now with the ability to see in real time what the traffic situations are and do what your Google Waze app tells you to do, it is pretty amazing. I live in Arlington, and I was coming home alternatively the other week on the Fresh Pond, and it routed me through Belmont, through these crazy local streets, and I was thinking the exact same thing, like, oh man, if I lived here, I would be like, what is going on? Like, is this really, the new route? So yeah, it can be crazy sometimes, but I think if it's a local residential street and the town can, there are some things that you can do to try to, slow that down and narrow the roadway, and obviously that makes it safer in general. But it's a trade-off because you have to give something up to be able to do that.
Can towns generate any congestion pricing or something? Is there a way for a town to generate?
No, you can't throw up tolls, right? You can't do that. You don't have, that towns don't have the authority to just say like, oh, let's throw up tolls. That'd be, that's an interesting thing in the future. But we've done some studies where people have said, oh, can we think about, a policy where we could, put tolls on these bridges here or something like that, but that's often outside that sort of realm.
Well, I do want to jump in and offer one creative solution and just another thought process. I would encourage you, before thinking about immediately how do we wall people off from our community, think about your experience when you're maybe trying to get to work against, like, how many people here have probably cut through someone else's neighborhood? in their own process, where I'm seeing people raise hands, like you've done it in someone else's community. And you don't want to cut people off from your community. You want them to bleed through and not know, that they're crossing community lines because they have to pay $5 to use your street. That's not good for business. That's not good for you. So what I would echo is think about how to make your neighborhood streets slower, repurpose that space, make it comfortable, make it beautiful, add green space, make it really great for someone who's with a stroller, someone who has a walker, add benches. Those are all signals to slow down. Another thing that I've heard, I do know that municipalities can reach out to companies like Waze and tell them that there are problems. There's also a hyper-local strategy that I'm not advocating for specifically Livable Streets, but there have been increasing stories of neighbors calling in fake accidents and gaming the data system. So know that you have power as citizens to manipulate the data that's sending people to your community.
But add something to this too, the speed, is the fundamental predictor of crash survival. If a, pedestrian is struck by a car going 20 miles an hour, they have, over 80% chance of surviving. Get that up to about 30 miles an hour, you're about a 50-50 clip. At 40 miles an hour, it's 80% chance of fatality. The notion of what, we're talking about is very real. I was interviewed earlier in the week for WBUR for the tragedy in Needham, and there was two high school age girls crossing the street in front of the high school on a road that is widely, is far too wide, promoting incredible speeds in an area where you can expect pedestrian activity. And we can't get serious about addressing those streets and those corridors where our most vulnerable users and our children are actively using these systems in our own communities. Then we got to look internally and reflect on what are our own values and why is it that we as a community can't say this road is fundamentally too fast, we need to do something about it and demand action.
Hi, my name is Rishi Yuan, Precinct 6, and I have a question regarding to electrical vehicles. And do you anticipate number of gas stations going down 50% over the course of 10 years?
Yeah, no, electric vehicles. I think there's a great anticipation that we're going to see a big increase in the use of electric vehicles. The state has like a requirement to try to encourage more electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles essentially. And there's a lot of companies that are investing huge money in this. A lot of experts feel like there is the potential, the sort of synergy between autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, because electric vehicles can go hundreds of thousands of more miles than your typical internal combustion engine, because it only has like 25 moving parts to it, so it's a much more efficient vehicle. So if you are running an autonomous fleet of taxis that are going to be generating tons of vehicle miles traveled, investing in electric vehicles is a smarter business move. And so if we move to this concept of transportation as a service and you are Uber and Lyft, you're going to buy electric vehicles, and then the market for electric vehicles is going to be much, much greater. So that's one sort of vision of how we're going to see this big increase in electric vehicles. And then what does that mean for what should the state be doing? What, in terms of incentivizing? I think definitely putting in the electric vehicle infrastructure is an important thing. There's already a state program to try to do more of that. Gas stations, again, I think that as you're a town and thinking about your long-term vision, where are future redevelopment opportunities? I think that's on the list, along with your large parking places. I think that's something to seriously think about.
I do just want to jump in and say, yes, definitely be thinking about how to invest in the electrification of your town and incentivizing electric fleets. However, strictly, as someone who's rooted in the environmental movement, a car that you own on your own that runs on diesel fuel versus a car that you own on your own that is electrically powered from coal doesn't actually change much in terms of emissions. And so there are these much bigger issues folks need to be thinking about. And I would say both of those cars, if you still own it and we don't invest in like shared autonomous technologies, they're probably spending 22 hours a day sitting somewhere, not being utilized. And so I would say, yes, we should be excited about electric vehicles. I would say we should be more excited about shared autonomy, these like flexible shared systems, and can those be electrified, because that's where you have more space on your streets, you're not parking cars, and you have a lot much more efficiency, and it's better for the climate.
Eric, time for more questions? Or?
I was gonna say about the revenue streams and parking as it comes up, I think it'd behoove us to just mention that it is the power that communities have in themselves to, meter their parking and actually take the revenue generated from that and invest it back into the community. That's a proven model that I think most communities do well served to contemplate.
But I think we could do one more.
Hi, my name is Bijan. I'm a town meeting member. In 2010, I didn't know better, so I collected 2,000 signatures for Sunday service and I passed it to the town meeting. But then MBT put the cutbacks, so I had to rush around and save the two buses, 62 or 76. Now I have a question about one comment about cut-throughs. Why not put bumps in the road like Watertown does? That could be very effective. Another thing is in China, they have electric tricycles that they go 60 miles an hour. They're enclosed, they can carry passengers. Why can't we do it? Or do we, like anything else, we have to import them from China?
So, Jason can maybe talk about the pros and cons of speed bumps, but in terms of one thing that you made me think about in terms of talking about like electric tricycles or scooters is the other thing that I think is really interesting is the concept of bike sharing. And so Lexington, you guys have invested in the Zagster system. MAPC, we've been working with a lot of the other cities and towns sort of are in the area from kind of Newton, Belmont, Arlington, over to Medford about doing kind of a regional bike sharing system. And we've actually selected sort of two companies that could provide this service through a collective procurement, and then it'll be up to the sort of municipalities in the area to decide if they want to be a part of that, and try to. I think that's an opportunity to try to expand sort of the bicycle sharing into the suburbs. There's the Hubway system, obviously in Boston and Cambridge, very expensive system for cities and towns to invest in. This is a lower cost kind of opportunity to provide another option for people, particularly for people who might be concerned about taking their bike and then having to lock it somewhere and having that kind of flexibility of kind of bikes on the go.
I'd add two things to this. Is someone who's implemented traffic calming projects in the suburbs around Boston. Traffic calming is not benign. When I say traffic calming, you're talking about your speed humps and your raised intersections and curb extensions. Honestly, the most effective to reduce speeds are vertical devices, which are your speed humps. You got to place those every 250 feet to maintain a speed that's roughly around 30 miles an hour. It's something that some communities think they want, and then when they realize that the bulk of the neighborhood is in opposition to it, they sometimes fall apart. I will say where they are successful is where there are pronounced cut-through issues. There was one in Westwood I was involved with around Route 109. I've never seen a cut-through quite like that. And that was a pretty successfully implemented traffic calming program. Another one in Framingham, but both of those had a just egregious amount of cut-through traffic and speeding issues. And it was a sense of we need to do something just to salvage our neighborhood. And as for the electric bikes, Providence, Rhode Island, I believe this spring is going to be the first city in the Northeast to introduce an electric bike share. So, that is another element in this that is coming.
Great. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll cut it there. There will be another panel on transportation forthcoming. I'm working on setting that up and getting the dates with staff. So if you didn't get your questions answered tonight, feel free to write them down on blue cards. And then also we hope that you all can show up to the next one.
Please clarify, is the panel different at the next, panel the same or different at the next transportation?
So I think I can, with some degree of certainty, tell you the next one will be different. There may be, I'm hoping there's one person who's gonna overlap for me, but I have two other people who have committed on supporting that date.
What's the topic of the next one?
So the one that's coming up next in order is housing,
That's for,
and I believe that's on March 13th. Is it 8 or 8:30? 8:30 a.m., same place.
it'll be in this building, but it'll be upstairs in the Hudson room, so same location, just different, then we have the same building.
Thanks to the panel, really